All right, welcome back, and let's get started with a great panel. First panel is called Incident Response in Europe, State of Play. We'll be looking at the entire waterfront here with three fantastic panelists. Let me start by introducing Laurance Dine. Laurance is a managing director at FTI Consulting in London with more than 20 years of experience in digital forensics, incident response, and leading global cyber defense teams. Welcome, Laurance.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Next up, let me introduce Robert Maddox. He's international counsel with Debevoise in London and a member of Debevoise's data strategy and security practice. Welcome back, Robert.
Hi, Bruce. Nice to see you.
And finally, very pleased to welcome back Rohan Massey. He's our moderator today. He's a partner at Ropes and Gray in London, but is actually joining us today from Boston in the US. And he's a leader of the firm's data privacy and cybersecurity practice. Rohan, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's great to be able to kick off this session on the incident response in Europe, the state of play. I'm going to cover a few topics. First of all, look at really the threat landscape, then look at some actual response issues and how they may have been changing, and then look at reporting issues as we go forward. But if we look to where we are today as to where we were 12 months ago, I think the old adage, what a difference a day makes, what a difference a year makes, is pretty relevant. So 12 months ago, if we were giving this, we would probably have said it had been quite a quiet year. We'd seen the resulting influence of the invasion of Ukraine, the implementation of sanctions, and the possible reconfiguration of resources in the threat actor space, which had seen a dramatic decrease, I think, in commercial threats or those against commercial organizations. Well, 12 months on, where are we? I think the situation is very much reversed. We've gone from a landscape where we had a drop off in figures to one that's come back stronger than ever. And the most recent figures that I saw from ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Agency, show that there's been sort of 200 or 300% uplift in threats in the last 6 months of this year. So we're seeing far more targeted, far more sophisticated threat attacks coming in. We're seeing them right the way down the pipeline and through the chain. So from supply chain attacks, different types of vulnerabilities, different types of threats coming through. So ransomware to sort of double exfiltration and encryption threats as well. So there's a sort of a changing landscape, I think, and one that's also certainly very, very busy and is keeping us busy. I mean, if I look at my practice, we're seeing a great increase in the resources needed to advise on incident and incident response. I mean, Robert, what are you seeing?
No, thanks, Rohan. I just echo everything you've said, really. And if I had to boil it down from what we've seen on our side, it's really that there's been, I'd say, an acceleration of pre-existing trends. We're going back to what you've seen before. You mentioned ransomware. We're seeing that again in large number of ransomware incidents, but then coupled with a little bit of disruption. So I think the starting point, from my perspective at least, is we see all of the same threats. Everything that you just listed off, we've seen them all before. Ransomware continues to blight, frankly, every sector of commerce. I don't think anyone's immune. And then in terms of initial access vectors, it's incredible to see phishing still right up there. In so many cases, it just falls down on that very, very human element of all of this, falling for a phishing email or similar. At the same time, though, I do think the landscape has changed. And the biggest change that I'd probably pinpoint, and we're talking to clients most about, is an increase in incidents where actually what we're seeing is data exfiltration, but then pure extortion, no encryption at all, not taking that additional step of deploying ransomware and encrypting systems or servers, etc. And coupled with that, and this is where I sort of see a little bit of the disruption that I mentioned earlier of the threat landscape, the threat actors that we're seeing perpetrating these types of extortion-based attacks are frankly very unpredictable in many cases, and really, really quite nasty. When I think of recent extortion incidents that we've worked on, you see the threat actors really jumping the fence between professional and personal lives, attacking not only corporate mailboxes, but then attacking executives' personal mailboxes and those of their family members. And we're talking leaking explicit, intimate photos, family photos, targeting children, calling children, SIM swapping attacks on family members. So it looks like you, the executive, are being called by your son, daughter, partner, whatever it might be. All of these different ways, frankly, to just push people's buttons harder and harder. And it is really giving clients a lot to deal with, and things that they might have got very good dealing with ransomware. They've improved backups, able to take systems offline very quickly. But those sorts of ransomware preparations don't help you for these pure extortion attacks. So I think just a few of the sort of the practical issues that are top of mind for me when I'm dealing with these incidents. In terms of unpredictability, I think you've got to try and draw on your full ecosystem of resources, people outside advisors, and try and have them tap into their networks. Because this is a growing threat, the number of data points aren't actually as great as they would be if you were dealing with one of the large ransomware groups. Conflicts of interest are particularly interesting here, I think, actually, as well, because when you see top-level execs, C-suite, often being the ones who are called on to make the decision of, do you pay the extortion demand or not? But they're also the people who are ultimately being harmed in a personal capacity. How do you manage that? And I think our tip is to companies to try and think about it in advance. You will have pre-existing conflicts of interest procedures that relate to your C-suite, relate to your boards, but you might not have had to deploy them in such truncated timescales as you have in the pressure of an incident. So I think the old adage of a little planning goes a long way, and the same for how you're going to actually support employees that do start being the victims of harassment. Having on-call resources, emotional support actually in these types of attacks is incredibly important. And we've certainly seen law enforcement agencies in the US being willing and able to provide that victim support on an individual level. And I think that's something that I think companies will want to make sure that they do have at their disposal as well. So a lot to chew on there, but I think really this extortion based threat vector is the biggest change that I've seen.
And it's quite an evolving landscape there, Robert. So, Laurance, what are your thoughts on the sort of, both the sophistication, I guess, and the sort of types of attack that we're seeing becoming more prevalent at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything Robert said, and I think there is kind of a shift into that direction. I still, there's still the professional setup, very kind and considerate threat actors. You don't think about threat actors being that way, but you do have like business response level threat actors that are just there for the money. I would say that the motivation behind both, from all these threat groups, is actually to make money. I think the way that the systems are now set up, where they're really diversifying who does what, sort of sharing out the work, right? So you have threat groups who are very good at getting access via phishing or other means, and you have groups that are very good at the negotiation or very bad at the negotiation, right? So depending on your perspective, and you have groups that will take the money and distribute it throughout, or that create the malware and to do the damage at the end. I agree that we see a mix of ransomware deployment and non-ransomware deployment. I've actually worked a couple of incidents this year where the ransomware was deployed and they never got contacted by the threat group, right? Because there was some sort of issue within the threat group chain, that disrupted them. And that specific threat group was Lockbit 3, but they're back online and happily back out deploying ransomware again and actively extorting clients. But those clients that we dealt with during that period of time were lucky. I mean, they were unlucky that they got hit with ransomware, but they didn't, they never had to deal with the threat group and the extra extortion. We're seeing every means that you can consider to get clients to pay the extortion, right? So it's not just, they do, I've seen exactly what Robert said, they go after family members, they try to expose anything that they can do. But they also will go to your supply chain, they will go to your clients, they will say, hey, we've hacked into this company and they have all your data and we can show you. And if they're not going to pay the bill, we want you to pay the bill. And they'll go individually to those other clients and say, you're being ransomed now. And some of those, they're big clients. It could be us, right? It could be you, the massive companies. It's not just individuals, right? So they will do anything and everything to get the ransom paid. And the other thing I will say is the efficiency is big, right? Because it used to be, dwell time would be a couple of months before they actually deployed ransomware, and they can do it easily within a day now, right? Like it's just bish bosh bam, the ransomware is out. If they want to do that, obviously for most of the time the tactic is take data, then deploy ransomware, and that way you're double hit in that situation.
Yeah, no, I certainly kind of agree with everything you said, and I think from our perspective as well, the idea, if we go back 12 months, was for far greater predictability. I think, you kind of went in, you knew what the negotiating position would be. You had a sort of a window of discount or whatever, and a window of time in which steps were going to be taken. And it just feels to me in the response scenarios now, there is far greater unpredictability, which, creates its own sort of issues for clients as well, and for advisors going in, because trying to, right, these are the steps that we need to take because we think we're going to see X, Y, and Z becomes a far harder position to advise on. And I guess that's, that will be one of the challenges. It'll be one of the challenges we see going forward. I guess we couldn't finish on this topic this year without mentioning the buzzword of the year, which is, of course, AI. I'm just wondering, what people are thinking about the impact of AI. I know, Robert, you mentioned, obviously, that phishing remains, or clicking on phishing links remains that key, or one of the most key drivers for incidents. I've seen statistics that are putting that over sort of 50% of incidents comrades come from the phishing links. And we know that we've been told, that generative AI developing far more sophisticated, realistic language, sort of emails, etc. But where are you seeing AI in any other instances that are being used for the purposes around the incidents and threats?
So I think just picking up first on the phishing point, which I think is a very interesting one. A lot of people talking about helps those who've maybe got English as a second language to far more convincing from quality of English language going up with the availability of large language models. I think the other aspect to it is it gives them access to effectively speaking like someone who works in a certain industry, because some of the large language models are very good if you prompt them, talk like write X in the way that someone from industry Y would speak. Suddenly they've got the right terminology, the right vernacular, and again, it just makes it that bit harder to identify. I think the biggest threat that we've seen manifest itself with respect to AI from a cyber standpoint is the risk involved in moving around very large data sets, moving something from an extremely secure production environment into a testing environment, development space, and actually not having robust policies and procedures and controls in place to ensure that the data is moved, and then the same high levels of security applied to it when people are, for want of a better word, tinkering with it, playing with it, trying to do great things, but falling down really on some of the basics.
Yeah, understood. Laurance, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think, it's absolutely correct that the first thing, and it is very simple, right? It's giving people the language skills and, the understanding of how those the industry people talk within that type of business. And, I would add they can utilize AI to get business intelligence, right? So there's aspects of that they can pull from AI. I don't think we're quite at the space where we think that that people are worried that's going to happen, or you have AI fighting against AI, right? Like, so you're trying to protect with AI and it's going in there. But I think we are at a position where, and we've already seen, AI being manipulated, right? Basically social engineering AI to do, or to give you information that it's not meant to do or to provide, but it does because of how you've asked the question, or how you've, it's been miscoded, or any other kind of aspect of that. And there will be times where they identify vulnerabilities, but I think we're not there yet, because why would threat groups focus on that when they can simply send an email that says click here and you win the lottery, and they do it and they get access to the gold mine, right? So I've been saying for 10 years that we have to kind of figure out what to do about phishing, and I've stopped saying it, right, because I don't think there is an overarching fix for that. I do think preparedness is key. Like, you need to prepare for stuff to happen. You need to prepare your employees on what to do, and in those situations you also need to train. But testing is also a big aspect, right? Because I know lots of people that have plans and playbooks and that kind of thing, and they've never opened them, and when you go to an incident and try to help them, they don't even know where the plan is, right? And that's, if you've taken the time to write something out to say this is how we're going to respond to these things, no matter what it is, and then you don't use it, it's not really helping you in that situation. So those are the types of things that you definitely want to be thinking about as an organization, is to make sure that you're ready for that. And maybe AI could help you with the plans and the playbooks, but right now, it's the basics. Obviously, we want to be thinking about what the future could potentially do, and folks like us, we need to be thinking about that and making sure that we're helping to protect our clients. But today, the majority of the stuff is just the standard techniques that we're dealing with.
Okay. Before I move off this topic, we have got one question in, and it sort of links to something we've seen a lot this year as well, which is, we've seen the supply chain become a target for a vulnerability, basically. If we look at the MOVEit attacks, the file transfer protocol attacks that we've seen, where you've got that internet access, the open access, that's been a key target for threat actors. So we're seeing a focus, I think, an increasing focus on diligence in the supply chain and understanding what the risks are of whatever the software or systems that you're using. And the question that's come in is whether we're seeing a slowdown or a flow down, on the impact of terms that suppliers are willing to agree or accept in respect of data liability, for instance, what the insurance cover is on that, and any issues. Is it a supplier's market or is that a customer's market? I think that from my perspective, there's a very clear focus on this. I'm not sure we've seen a shift coming right the way through yet to clarify whether it is a supplier's market or a customer's market. But I think that's an area. If you've got any thoughts on that, Robert, I'd be interested to hear them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree with you. I don't think we've probably seen it fully crystallize. The one thing that I would say, and this links to our discussion about AI, is I've been quite surprised with some of the big providers, the room for negotiation in those service agreements, that if you were trying to negotiate a mainstream cloud agreement with them, sometimes, good luck getting them to change anything. But actually in sort of the new space of some of the AI service offerings, we've seen clients make some pretty good headway actually negotiating terms. So I just use that as one example of a supplier where we are seeing the suppliers listening to security concerns and taking them on board. I think in addition to contractual terms, the perhaps on the diligence side, the most effective technique that I've come across was something that was a CISO at a German manufacturing company told me about, which is, he said, he always tries to get the supplier's CISO on the phone, and you can learn so much more in 15, even 20 minutes than you can with having someone fill out a form.
Yeah. And Laurance, on the insurance side, do you think insurance is helping here? Is it helping to mitigate, transfer the risk, or reduce the cost of recovery? Or are we seeing the insurance market? I mean, we know that it's changed dramatically. Premiums have gone sky high. I think coverage is narrowed. But any thoughts there about how insurance may be helping in the response as well?
Well, I mean, I think insurance is going through a change, right? So they running policies across the board, and we know that during the slowdown, or I think part of the slowdown was because of the insurance companies, because they got rid of some of those policies. And when you don't have policies, maybe you don't report some of the things that or respond to some of the incidents that some clients would have had. So I know that in the industry, they're rethinking how they write policies, what they're willing to cover. And I also know that there are there are clients that are moving away from insurance, right? They're saying, we'll have our own insurance. They'll put a bucket of money there. I know the insurance companies don't want that to happen. But I think it will regulate itself. I think they probably overinsured, and now they need to rethink and say, okay, what are we willing to cover? And we'll get to that space. The thing with insurance for us is they are, I would say it's definitely beneficial for people to have. I'm not advising around that kind of thing, but it's definitely beneficial. But I've seen a lot of clients who thought they had really good cyber insurance that didn't actually have cyber insurance, right? It was written in something else. And so, I think people are smarter now. A lot of clients are better at that and reading in and getting advice and guidance on what it covers. But 5 years ago, they certainly weren't. And some of it, they didn't have coverage at all, and they thought they were going to get the bill paid, and they didn't. But so I think it's a help. Definitely, I wouldn't argue against having cyber insurance. I think it's the right thing to do. But I also think you have to be smart about what it is and what you want it to be to cover for yourself.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we've got more questions coming from the audience, which is fantastic. And in fact, one of them is a fantastic link to the next topic that I really want to discuss, which is sort of actual response and response issues. And one of the questions that's come in is that assuming an adversary can get into your system, how important is it in your response, your incident response or crisis management process, that you can shift off your network for the coordination of communication? And this is something that the three panelists discussed earlier when we think about breach response and how that's changed in the last 12 months. And I think, is it 12 months or is it slightly longer? And I think we have to bring COVID in here as to the way that's changed the working environment and the way it has changed how we interact. We have far more remote working now, etc. But what do we do at the point of crisis? How has response to the threat changed? And I'd like to sort of discuss here really, maybe perhaps you, Robert, just sort of talking, when you're working with clients, do you think that the approach to response has changed? And is it driven by the different types of attack, or is it driven by the way that we work today?
Yeah, I think it has changed a little bit, because if I think back to pre-COVID, and it wasn't for every incident by any means, but the number of times that we would go on site with a client during those early days of an incident, it was far more common than it is now. It's pretty rare now that people want you there. And I think part of that is because the repeated message that we get is there wouldn't be much point in you being here because our people are all spread out in a way that they weren't spread out before. I'm not talking about, we've got an incident that's global and it's impacting 50 different jurisdictions. And of course, everyone's in different places then. But I'm talking about something where you're wanting to convene people at head office and actually people have relocated. You've got the advantage of COVID in a way, which it opened up the labor market. CISOs, the pool of CISOs from which you could recruit when you're working remotely was wildly different from if you were looking for people who are willing to relocate to your location. And it really, really helped some companies get people who pre-COVID and more flexible working arrangements, they wouldn't have been able to tap into. So great from the talent pool. It can just create these issues of getting people together all in one room, which often is helpful. Ultimately, I think when you boil incident response down, it's an inherently human endeavor, predicated on strong interaction between different people. And I think that's hard to replicate in a fully virtual environment. It's got to be an element of it, but it's hard to fully replicate. And we've seen some clients bringing back more in-person war rooms during their incidents, because that also helps solve the concern that the question relates to, which is out-of-band communications. The easiest way to be out of band is actually to be speaking to people face to face. But I've said a lot there. I'm interested to hear what Laurance thinks as well. But yeah, out of band communications absolutely key, and I'm sure Laurance can probably say more than I can on that as well.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think you should have a secondary setup before anything happens, right? Some sort of out of band communications. I would 100% agree on the change in the response, and I have literally said that, like, let's get together where we all meeting, and they're like, well, there'd be no point in you coming here because you'd be the only one in the office, right? So it definitely has changed how we respond. It's definitely changed how we communicate. It's very difficult. Like on this call, two of us can't talk at the same time. Having side meetings, it can be difficult. We'd have to say, hey, Rohan, let's meet in a second. Like, let's go over here and have this conversation. I have incidents now where we open up a Teams video and you sit on it for 8 hours, and there's no way for you to have the side conversation. Only one person. Maybe it's a good thing that only one person can speak at a time, as long as it's the right one person who's speaking, right? Because that can cause problems. So I'm a big advocate of being with the powers that be, the people who run the business during the first few days of an incident, because you do get the information that you need a lot easier. It just flows within those types of situations. And in the virtual environment, sometimes you miss what somebody said. If you've been sat on this call for 4 hours, you're wandering off doing something else, and you didn't get that key vital piece of information, and you have to backtrack and that kind of stuff. So I would definitely like to see us go back to that. I don't know that we ever will, but I think it would help, especially in the crisis.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point about the sort of the linear or binary, I should say, interaction on a screen. One of the big issues that we always have when we're dealing with incident response is that many decisions need to be taken at the same time or with very, very rapidly. Nearly all of them need to be taken by the same 2 or 3 senior executives, and trying to get those much easier to do when you are in a room together. Especially when, I think from our perspective, this is advisors coming in, for most of our clients, hopefully it's their first incident, right? And so they are looking very much for, to trusted advice, guidance, etc. And being able to do that across a number of work streams at the same time or very quickly is much more helpful to them, I think, than having to go from one meeting to another on a very sort of binary linear process. So I've done a number of training exercises this year, and it's been interesting to see that clients have been bringing people together to in-person rooms, and as they're building their response plan and developing it post the exercise, that has been one of their key areas of focus, which is we would seek to be in, maybe not all in the same room, it could be in 2 rooms depending on how the business is split geographically, but at least having some central hub where people are together and working together, and they see the efficiencies of that. So I think, to me, this is a really important part of the incident response, because it is that time critical sort of multi-channel and dynamic decision-making process that all of us have to deal with. So I find that quite fascinating. I also think with regard, we're talking, Robert, about CISOs, where we've seen, and I think we're seeing an increasing focus now on personal liability and risk for certain individuals and functions within the business. So for those people to be comfortable that they have voiced what they needed to voice and it be heard, from their own, if we look back at what's happened, the CISO and SolarWinds in the US and the liability issues that are coming up there, that in as well presents a challenge. I think that maybe in-person meetings might be a point to resolve that. What do you think, Robert?
I do. I think not least because if I'm sitting in the role of a CISO, I want to have built strong relationships with senior management, and I want to have built strong relationships with those below who are reporting up, to know that you have the right level of candor on these issues. Because actually, I think that's what a lot of that, what you're alluding to, comes back to, is this ability to voice concerns, but also to hear concerns. And if you are not there sitting with a team that you're supposed to be leading, I think that's quite tricky. Not impossible, but then you've got to course correct for it. And you would want to have something that is able to demonstrate to third parties, whoever that might be, or internally, that yes, I have given room for my team to report issues up to me, and I've given myself the opportunity to listen. That if I just sit there at my desk and very transactional in my interactions with people, that I might not otherwise get.
Yeah, and I think that's not just the sort of a point of response, right? That has to be in day-to-day operations, in planning, in vulnerability assessment and management at ongoing basis. And Laurance, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think tracking and communication would absolutely be key, right? And in an incident, prior to an incident, all that stuff can be dictated and logged, and you should have that available. But in an incident, having somebody as the person who controls the log, having the incident commander in the room, having, as we talked about previously, the C-suite, those people that are making that decision, they're knowledgeable, they understand what the implications are for themselves. And if you're having side conversations, which are inevitable anyway, but even more so in a virtual environment, I'm going to contact the IT person who has access to the log files because that's the information that I'm after. There may be a discussion between the two of us that goes completely outside of the legal, like you might be there and think, actually, you shouldn't be doing that for that log because it's got GDPR implications, and this regulation is going to have that, right? So those are a lot of things that if there are things that are happening that the incident commander, the people who have oversight of an incident, and obviously you can't be watching everything, but those things are where you end up in trouble, right? Like that's how and it's CISOs who said, hey, I did this. They're like, well, where's it logged? Like who did you tell? How do you know? And you could find yourself in situations where you're, speaking to a regulator, and that's not a place you want to be.
Well, in fact, that's a very good sequitur, though. I think if we move to the last topic that I do want to cover, because I think it's one that has changed dramatically over the last 12 months. And it's changed not just in Europe, I think it's a global issue, which is that of reporting. So the how, when, and why reporting in relation to incidents, the assessment of incidents, etc. If we cast our minds back to the heady days of 2018 and the GDPR coming in, and I think sort of laser-like focus not only on the 20 million euro fine and 4% of global turnover, which seems to be everybody's mantra, but that there's a 72-hour notification requirement, right? That sort of took the headlines. If we look at where we are now, the new Indian guidance came out earlier this year, and there's certain elements within India now need to be reported in 4 or 6 hours. We've seen legislation coming through in Europe that is requiring, end of day notification in certain instances of requirements. So we're seeing the obligations to notify regulators changing, the timeframes in which to do it, and I think the information to be provided changing as well, because I think an end of day notification is going to be relatively light on information. We know that it will then get followed up with other details. But how should we be planning and thinking about that? Is it great to be aiming for fastest response, quickest response? Is it better to say, well, we'll actually take our time and look at something? Where do we balance the risk for clients of saying, well, we think there may be a problem, therefore you should notify. So it almost gets to the point of over notification, which in itself can cause questions as to, well, actually, how good is your program, if your compliance program, if you can't assess yourselves whether or not this is actually a reportable incident, so you're just firing the gun every time. Yeah, so many different challenges, I think, coming in because of all of the different pieces of regulation, different jurisdictions, and incidents these days are very rarely national. They're nearly always international. There's some element of international data in there, etc. Just really, I'd be interested. I'll start with you again, Robert. Just getting some ideas about, thoughts on the pressures that reporting and timing can put out there.
Yeah, I mean, where to start? I mean, it's an absolute soup, isn't it, of the different regimes that you could be reporting under, and then trying to understand not just what the law says on paper, but actually understand what that regulator, what that authority's practice is in reality. Because sometimes a law in one jurisdiction might sound very, very similar in a risk of harm threshold to a law in another jurisdiction. And then you get on a call with local counsel, a true expert in the application of that jurisdiction's law, and they say, oh, no. In practice, it says X, but in reality, we see it say Y. And the regulator applies a much lower threshold to that reporting trigger than you might think on the face of it. So I think if I distill that down, I think it's making sure you're speaking to people with the right expertise, as the level of sophistication amongst some of the international regulators outside of the US, the UK, the EU actually develops. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. Historically, you've seen companies put to one side certain jurisdictions. Oh, the regulator there isn't particularly active. It's changing very rapidly which regulators are active. And a bit like the threat actors, forgive me for saying it, but some of these regulators are pretty unpredictable as well. And their enforcement priorities and their enforcement approach and their supervisory approach seems to change pretty regularly.
And when we're talking about regulators now, I mean, I think about the good old days and think, well, was it just, the data protection authorities, or are there more authorities as well?
I think the financial services regulatory space is just a bit of a quagmire. DORA, the EU Digital Operational Resilience Act, that sort of bites come January 2025, is hoping, I think, to address some disparities which have emerged over time between some of the different European financial services regulators in the EU, and harmonize reporting. Because at the moment, for instance, if you were a payment services provider, you could be notifying under GDPR at the same time as the second Payment Services Directive implementing legislation in jurisdiction. You might then just have a more general overarching obligation to notify a financial services regulator. You could be notifying the New York Department of Financial Services. Yeah, the list goes on. So I think privacy, yes, still very much there. Financial services, absolutely. And then a trend that we've seen crystallize in the EU with the expansion of critical infrastructure and what that actually means through the NIS directive, second NIS directive now. But if you speak to people elsewhere, you see the same in Australia, for example, where their list of critical infrastructure is extremely broad. And then you've just got yet another layer to think about when you're dealing with a soup, all with different reporting forms, or in many cases with different reporting forms, some commonalities, but it does make it a bit of a logistical challenge, to say the least, to do all of this in parallel. And I think the only way you can do it effectively is if you've planned for it and mapped out who it is that we're going to have to tell about these types of incidents in advance.
Thank you. And Laurance, your thoughts on the engagement, notification engagement with regulators. Obviously, you left your last comment was on quite a positive note, I'll say, for want of a better word. But thoughts from you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what Robert said, and having the pre-planning and knowing who you have to notify. And I've actually spoken to regulators, when they talked about the 72-hour thing to begin with, and told them what the difficulties with that would be. And, you're going to define what you mean by, incident, or are you just going to leave that vague? And obviously, there's a lot of vague in a lot of these regulations around what an incident is, and, when you want to respond and what's required. And, what I was told at the time was that they just, a general notification that something is happening would be fine, right? And I'm like, well, that doesn't say that. To me, it doesn't say. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't write regulations either. But so I think those types of things create difficulty. So you absolutely have to have expertise. And I would say reporting outside of regulations and outside of legal aspects, like you need to understand when you should report to the public that something is going on, right? And having a communications expert in to actually have that conversation, because the reputational damage, or the inverse of that, right? So, we've seen really good reporting out there that, that immediately said, hey, we've been hit. This is what's going on. We were providing good information. It's actually good for the industry to understand what threats are happening. We're going to let you know step by step. And they continued to do that and didn't take any impact on their reputation. Whereas others, tried to keep it a little bit more secret, didn't really want to talk about it. And the impact to them is massive, right? So I think we're all kind of saying the same thing around all of this, right? Is making sure that you're planning for these things and have your own expertise, or bring in experts to kind of help you with these issues.
Yeah, and we have had a question in actually saying, is there potential because of the National Security and Intelligence Services laws to be conflicting to prevent reporting? I think from my perspective, I would say it wasn't just actually the National Security and Intelligence laws. There are so many different laws that can prevent, or at least factor into your reporting progress, because some of them, I know in the US, some states have first reporting obligations. You've got to supposedly report it on them first before anything else. And then you're suddenly doing a whole balancing act as well. So one of the key issues I think that we do have is the potential now for conflict, as we see greater and greater regulation in this space, and when I'm talking about greater regulation, if we look at the EU in the digital sector, so this is why we're now getting far more broader than privacy. It's broad data and digital. There are 104 pieces of legislation currently in progress, either in draft or being proposed to regulate this space, and that's just in Europe. And then we can start, moving that around other jurisdictions. We're up for a very challenging time, I think, from a regulatory perspective, which is where we find ourselves in response to incidents that have come in, breaches that have happened, and trying to make sure that balance is kind of practical and efficient, because really the purpose of the notifications and everything else is to try and understand the threat landscape at a national, international level. It's B, to protect individuals, from a risk of harm, whether that's financial harm, personal harm, or anything else, and to sort of manage the digital society in which we live. And I think it's just going to become more and more challenging as we move forward for businesses to do this. I think, as I say, the last 12 months have certainly shown us that this is an incredibly dynamic space. I think I don't want to sort of look forward to see what we think there could be in the future. Do we think this is going to be a quiet year going forward? Robert, any thoughts? We've got a minute to wrap up, but what would your thoughts be for next year?
I think what I'm most interested to see is, look, in the US with the SEC, there's huge scrutiny on public companies and and their disclosures to the market of incidents. I'm very interested to see whether any of the securities market regulators here in the UK and Europe latch on to a similar theme.
Okay. Laurance, thoughts for you for, where we see this space?
I don't think we're going to see it quiet. I think it's going to continue to increase as we, have seen since the break with COVID and everything. So I think we should all be ready, get some rest over Christmas and the holidays, and, get ready back in January to kick back off again.
Well, get rest over the holidays. I think that's usually our busiest time, right? We know they love those holiday dates for just dropping in the threats and the breaches, but hopefully they won't, and we can all get some rest over the holidays. But thank you very much for discussing this today. And I'm Bruce, you're back on, so I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Rohan, and Robert and Laurance. Terrific job, and thanks for getting us off to such a great start. Our next panel will be in 5 minutes. It's going to be a look at the FBI and European incident response. So we'll come back and see us at 2 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. We'll be right back.